evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this post-screening discussion, courtesy of our panel here. I am Michelle from the Twin Cities Film Fest. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoyed the screening of our special streaming event of Black Boys. And thank you again to Sonia Lohman, the director, for allowing us to showcase that film. As our executive director mentioned before we started the screening, we appreciate having all of these opportunities, and so we want to make sure that we honor our directors for allowing us to provide this to all of you. Please continue to support the film and tell your friends, your family, and your loved one everything that you thought about the film. So that brings us to our post-screening discussion. I am very happy to have three notables from the Twin Cities joining us today for a discussion on diverse storytelling during turbulent times. So to help me with this conversation, I am honored to introduce to some of you and hopefully reintroduce to many of you our panel this evening. So I will start with, in the order that they are in my particular screen. So starting up here in the corner, the amazingly talented and Emmy-nominated journalist and visual storyteller, Georgia Fort. Good evening, Georgia. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yes, and also with us, the executive director of the Hallie Q. Brown Community Center in St. Paul, Jonathan Palmer, another friend of mine. Hello, Jonathan. How's everything going for you as well? Oh, I feel like you might be muted.
I was muted, of course, the classic thing.
Yes.
There we go. I've gotten it out the way so nobody else has to make that mistake. I am glad to be here with everybody.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we appreciate you sharing this evening with us. And then also with us, ethical storyteller, producer, and videographer, Miss Deborah Honore. Thank you for joining us as well, Deborah. How's everything going with you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
I feel as though that is a question that is already so loaded for us. And so thank you very much for everybody joining in with that one. And thank you for joining us this evening as we are talking about this, because you are all storytellers. I've had the opportunity to share with Jonathan, to talk to Georgia before, Deborah. We have talked about how we are navigating this storyteller road. And so I thought we would start with, when we are talking about diverse storytellers, that's not anything new. But Deborah, I thought you had a good definition of what are we really looking at when we say diverse storytellers. So do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, I think so. When I first connected with you on the topic that we'd be talking about and looking at diverse storytelling, I think often when we talk about diverse anything, it often becomes this black and white conversation and leaves out just this plethora and diversity of voices that not only need to be included in the conversation, but are critical in understanding like the bigger picture of what's going on in the world. So I just really wanted to talk more about how are we defining diverse storytelling? It's not just a diversity and inclusion and equity thing, but also looking at who's telling the stories and are we honoring them? And is it made not just for, I think what a lot of people think of as the white normative gaze in America media, but also are we creating media for ourselves and are we honoring our own voices? And I think that's a piece of it.
It also makes me think there are so many, we do see, if we go through the Hollywood version of a lot of these stories, I call it the Disneyfication of racism and complex topics, where things have such a tidy bow put on them. Do you think that allowing diversity in the people who are telling the stories helps give it more honor?
I definitely think so. I think that making sure that we have diversity outside of what we have defined it as popularly also gives us more opportunity to look at a world that we want to see beyond just what I think is prescribed to us. Like we just saw in the film that just aired, a lot of our narratives of ourselves are fed to us at a young age through a system that already has a plan for how we live our lives and where we fit into the bigger picture of systemic oppression and things of that nature. So yeah, I think I don't know if that answered the question, but I think it's important, especially because it gives people more an understanding more of who they can be beyond just what they've been fed their lives.
Right. And Georgia, I know that, with your background as a journalist and also the storytelling that you're doing now, like it's very boots on the ground with what you've been doing lately. How is it when you are so in the midst of all of the community trauma that is going on to still try and find that new narrative and decide what stories you decide to share?
Yeah, I think it's definitely challenging. But at the same time, I feel like there's a duty and there is a responsibility to continue to do what I can to find that narrative, especially coming from a mainstream media background and knowing what that fabric is made of, being a part of so many editorial conversations that don't value portraying us in a positive light,
Right,
being a part of so many editorial conversations and mainstream media, pitching stories and getting feedback like, who cares?
right,
Or, talking to other Black women who, across the country are a part of these, newsroom meetings, and always feeling like we're the angry, mad Black woman because
right,
we're disputing another mugshot being shown in a newscast. What is the purpose? What is going to come from this? How is our audience going to, how are their lives going to be enhanced by reporting on petty crimes just to put another Black mugshot in a newscast? And so for me, there is an inherent obligation to be boots on the ground, to amplify truth. And then also, I feel like there is a large portion of significant stories that never make national news. I think back to my interview with attorney Benjamin Crump when he was here to advocate for the life of Kelvin Horton and
right,
demand that the business owner who killed him be held accountable, which still hasn't happened.
right.
That story never made national headlines. And so as I'm, covering stories and people are looking through my portfolio, and I hear a lot, when people come across that, they never heard of Kelvin Horton. So I
Right.
think that there's an obligation, especially when you know both sides, mainstream, and I guess you could say alternative media. There's an obligation to continue searching for that other narrative.
Right. And Jonathan, as the executive director of the Hallie Q. Brown Community Center, you do a lot of interaction with our actual community. So, do you see that need for more storytelling, that need for being represented as people are coming to the community center and going, I don't always see myself showcased appropriately?
Most definitely, and one of the programs we have is our youth enrichment program, as well as our early learning center. So we have young people who aren't seeing themselves reflected, and the need for that to be there, to be front and center, so that people can understand it's a much broader scope than they're really used to. We also have historical archives there that chronicles the history of the Rondo community, and Hallie Q. Brown, being a 92-year-old African American organization, being there in the community and seeing all of that history. And, Georgia's boots on the ground piece is so key because there's this broad misconception that Black history began with slavery. Sometime later, Martin Luther King was born. Then
Right.
Barack Obama became president, and that's really all that happened. Turns out there's a lot more.
Right.
And people have to understand that piece. And the boots on the ground is where the actual stories get told. Versus actually getting into a lot of the pieces that you find in the quote unquote standard media. Our namesake, Hallie Quinn Brown, is a very pivotal figure, but most people don't know about her because
Right.
when you search through the main media, you don't find stories. But when you search through the Western Appeal, the Spokesman Recorder, all the archives of the Black newspapers, you find this woman who is doing all sorts of impressive things across the country.
Right. Well, to our panel in general, I think you bring up a good point, Jonathan. Are there any other storylines that immediately would pop to mind that you go, I wish more people knew about, and you are maybe still surprised that people have not run with that particular diverse narrative?
I will say Hallie Quinn Brown. This was a woman. She's one of those hidden figures of history. At the turn of the 20th century, she was traveling around Europe and America talking about women's suffrage issues, talking about civil rights issues. She spoke before the 1924 Republican National Convention, represented the United States at the International Congress of Women in 1893, campaigned for Calvin Coolidge, had tea with Queen Victoria, was Dean of Women at Tuskegee, and nobody knows about her because there's no Lifetime original movie or action figure or anything like that.
Right.
And so you have that. And she actually wrote a book called Homespun Heroines and Women of Distinction, profiling 60 African-American women living between 1760 and 1920 that most people don't know about. And she said they need to. The first Black woman to get a Bachelor of Arts degree, Booker T. Washington's wife, Phyllis Wheatley. There's so many stories within BIPOC communities that are not being told that need to be front and center so that we can get beyond this idea that the white lens that is generally considered the default for America is factual and truth. There is a much wider lens that needs to be focused on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that also, one of the things that I bring up is why do you think that we have this, I'll call it pushback, when we do start to showcase more of these stories? I feel like I hear often when you go, we start, showcasing BIPOC history and those kind of things, then there's kind of this, well, you don't need to do that. If you showcase those stories, you're really just showing that we aren't all part of the same American narrative, or showcasing these stories seems to have this negative connotation. And it continually pops up that way. Do any of you have any ideas on why you think that that's the case?
I mean, I think it's the implicit bias. I think it's the, white supremacy that we are fighting against. There's some school, I forget what city it was in, but just recently, there were parents in the town that were asking to ban Black History Month.
Right.
And, so when you hear that rhetoric, to me, that is a part of the white supremacist narrative that, continues to uphold the status quo. And so I don't think that celebrating the accomplishments and the legacy of Black folks negates how important white people are too. I think
Agreed.
that both things can be true. And so for me, when I see people who are pushing back, I think that even if they're not overtly racist or violence or using racial slurs, I do think that there is something there that is rooted in discrimination and white supremacy. And so as the world has had to face this racial reckoning, I really believe since the murder of George Floyd, the reality of it is that type of pushback to me it's anti-Black. And, we should be concerned about it.
Mm-hmm. And I think a quote that pops into my mind as well is that I can't remember the exact words, but essentially it was talking about if white America felt equality, it would feel like oppression to them. And I think that a big piece of why there's so much pushback is because white supremacy and white bodies have owned so much of what we see, of where we live, and that a majority of the narratives that are let out aren't necessarily owned by us because, and it shows we don't have full permission of how people see us because we don't have permission of how, for so long, of how our image is put out into the public, right? So there's pushback because of ownership. And I personally believe that if others don't see themselves, I feel like if others who aren't oppressed don't see themselves, they start to feel like they're not being represented because it's how they've lived all their lives.
Right.
And that can be hard to explain to others. Well, yeah, it's the whole conversation of why do people feel need to say all lives matter, right? Well, you feel the need because you feel, racism and all that sort of stuff as well, right? But I think that underlying as well is that if you feel excluded or you don't feel like you're being represented in any sort of way, there's often pushback from that just because of the privilege you've lived with all your life. So I think that plays a huge role as well.
I think one of the things that and this is just a small portion of Black Boys, but they did bring up the movie Black Panther, and so that made me think of a particular story with a friend of mine who happens to be white, and how he just could not relate. And we had this big discussion on why he didn't like the film, and he's like, well, and it really came down to he was so unaccustomed to seeing characters that mirrored him that he just couldn't get into it.
Yeah.
I'm like, what do you think we've been doing for generations? It's like, I'm like, you need to broaden. I've had to, for a long time, broaden my imagination to see myself in this fictional world. And that's what we do every day. And trying to explain that, nope, you still can be part of this. These things, just because it's a film that happens to primarily have a BIPOC cast, it doesn't mean you're not going to enjoy it. You just have to get used to it. And I think it is reflex. And we just have not ever gotten to a point that seeing these BIPOC narratives have become reflectual of other people. So they don't know how to do it yet. So how do we help them learn to do it? Because we have all learned throughout our careers to figure out how to blend or and now we are, I think, as you mentioned, Georgia, there is this awakening. And so we are being more encouraged to take up space and to be more bold. But how do we help our colleagues into this new space so that we all can become closer to that position of equality and parity?
Well, I think part of the thing is sharing the experiences like we're doing now and talking with them. The whole piece, the pushback that comes from that, in an agreement with both Georgia and Deborah, is also the fact that you're tearing down the narratives that they have lived their whole lives with. The fantasy of white being the default within this country and what everybody thinks of as this is what history is, this is what right is. You've got to go ahead and trust the police, and there are great members of the police. This is not anti-police, but right. There's a lot of people in our community who have had very bad experiences, and I think just about every Black person has had at least one negative experience. And you can see things like Philando Castile, you can see things that happen, with George Floyd, all of these that get piled on, and it's a reality that white America doesn't see, right, and doesn't know and doesn't experience. And then when they look at what we see, it's become something that threatens the idea of what is right, what is perfect, what is good, because you're saying, no, America is not the great country that you think it is. It's a great country, has great things. But there's also another piece that we have to go ahead and be honest about and take a look at and understand the history since 1619 in this country that has brought us to this point, and the ideas that have been covered over, from Confederate statues to the invention of the white identity that didn't exist before slavery and didn't exist before this. It's all of these pieces that people, when I talk to people about this, they're like, wait a minute, that's not true. We've always been. No, you haven't always been. And here's the reasons why this exists in this country. Right. This is Juneteenth. This is what happens. It's been here.
Right. And I just want to let everyone who has joining us and is watching us now, if you do have any questions from our panelists, you can go ahead and put your question in the chat. I'll be happy to share that with them as well. We do have a number of people that have said that they do agree with you that there does need to be a wider lens as we tell these stories. Also, that we need to make sure that we are showing as many stories as possible. And so as we are, if we were, I think before we all started, we were just talking about what our, the four of us were talking about what our Februarys look like. And how not that we're not popular, but we are exceptionally popular in February as we go throughout Black History Month. And how do we encourage people to, just as we make how do we celebrate Christmas all year long? How do we encourage them to go, Black History Month does not need to only be in February. Here's the appropriate way for you to engage and ask these questions throughout your day to day?
I think it has to be a lifestyle, you know,
Mhm.
it has to become a part of our culture. And I think, you know, some ways of doing that is memorializing more of our heroes. So you look
Mm.
at street names, you know, our heroes shouldn't just have streets named after them in the Rondo community, you know, in more affluent areas, we should celebrate them too. And when you look at, you know, during the civil uprising last year across the country, there were Confederate statues torn down all across the country. Why don't we see more of our heroes celebrated in that way? And so I think, you know, when allies and even our community can continue to uplift the people who have contributed to Black heritage, I do think that is when we'll truly start to see our history
Mhm.
celebrated beyond just the month of February.
And or did I cut you off?
No, go ahead.
um,
I come to you anyway, so I have
oh,
you go
cool.
ahead, and then I have a question. So
Yeah, I think another piece of that too, kind of adding to what you were saying, Georgia, is that one of the things that I often kind of struggle with is this want to move past this barrier that's set in front of me to be a teacher. When it comes to like talking about diversity and bringing more diverse stories to the forefront. Kind of going back a little bit to the question you'd had before about how do we bring in our white peers, or other word as allies, into the conversation and have them be a part or understand what's going on in the storytelling realm, beyond what's like in popular media. I think that it's not just important to like memorialize our heroes, but it's also important to uplift the current voices and the current artists that are out there. And not to, because I really do think that by putting on the responsibility of being a teacher, you're actually stifling the creative process for a lot of creatives of color and a lot of storytellers. And one of the things I remember seeing this like thread a while ago about the need to actually look at being a teacher as an actual, like it's a job, it's a role. It's tiring.
Yeah.
It requires the proper amount of time. It's not just something that, you know, you're not just a search engine. You know what I'm trying to say? Like somebody can't just come to you and have you break down how, you know, who are the people you can watch and support. There's resources online and people who are actively doing that work. And I think it's, you know, about upholding and uplifting those members in our community that are doing that great work, but also too like uplifting, you know, just Black joy and just like having, you know, BIPOC, non-normative, you know, perspectives of art and storytelling out there in the public, and letting people get with it or catch up. Because I think that for so long we've been taught that we need to be responsible of bringing in our white peers or kind of teaching them what's going on. And I don't think that that's been working, and I don't think that that will work in the future unless that is like your actual vocation and that's the work. Because you know, people go to college to learn college. People get masters and doctorates and really learn about the history and the work that it takes to bring down systems of oppression and to learn the history. And I think that it carries more weight than just giving everybody that title. I think if you want to be the storyteller, then definitely be the storyteller. If you want to work in informing your white colleagues, then take that on. If you're doing both, there's an intersect as well. But just to give every person of color who's a storyteller that identity or that responsibility is oppressive in its own nature.
And thank you for sharing that. I think that at, you know, one of the discussions that I had with some of my other communicator friends is we all have our lanes, as you said. And so some of us choose, you know, I choose to have that, you know, cultural sensitivity be one of the platforms that I speak on. I choose, and some of my friends do not. And so I agree with you that it is allowing the people who choose to take up that space do it, and the other people, it's having enough voices that we
Right.
can have different lanes, and you don't have to
Exactly.
be every single thing because you're
Exactly.
the only one.
Exactly.
So just like we don't expect every woman to be the voice of all womanhood, we're trying to move away from that kind of thing too.
Mhm.
That's a lot of pressure of you saying you have to do all of the things.
Mhm.
And I appreciate this. Linda has said a number of different things in the chat. So how not to burn you out. I appreciate this, and I think that we can and cover this as we are beginning to wrap up, because this is kind of what we were hitting on: is how do you not burn out of this? And I think that it really, and I'm curious to see what the rest of our panel thinks. It really does for me. I know that I have a longer fuse for those type of things because that's where I put my emotional resources,
Mhm.
versus some other subject matters that I'm going, okay, that here's somebody that can be the expert on that. Here, so it is you being able to hold space for yourself in certain areas and go, okay, that's just not one of the things that I'm going to tap in on. What do you, the three of you think is also a way that we could not burn ourselves out? Or is there ways that, or resources that we can in bulk provide to people so that they can go, here's what I'll do, and I'll do some of the work instead of burning out the one person that I know that might be able to talk to me about this?
Well, I'll say that, one, it's going back to picking your lanes and deciding what your role is going to be. For me, it's a life choice.
Mhm.
My parents got married when it was still illegal in the country for them to get married.
Mhm.
And I've grown up with that and grown up being involved with the racial divide throughout my entire life. And being there on the front lines, being able to have these conversations, it's something that I choose because I'd rather share good information and correct information.
Right.
It should not be an expectation of BIPOC people that they will answer all your questions. That's not our job. But there's some of us who choose to do that. And if we're choosing, you should go ahead and ask those questions and talk. And what rejuvenates me about that is seeing things that have results. Looking at countries all over the world having Black Lives Matter marches did amazing things for me last year. In dealing with all the stuff that we were facing, when I turned and I saw that in England, in France, in all these other places, that they were joining in with the same message saying Black Lives Matter, they're not being validated. We need to validate that. That says a lot. That says that we're making progress. Even if it's slow progress, it is still progress. And doing things that we can connect with each other and support one another is how I think we keep from getting burned out.
I think environment is also very critical to avoid burnout. If you are in a harmful environment, an environment that has cultivated anti-Blackness, I think it's going to be very challenging to avoid it. And so, sometimes I see folks in our community who are afraid of using their voice in their workspace because they don't want to lose their job, or they're struggling with a company that says they're prioritizing DEI, but
Right.
there's no actionable items, nothing tangible that's coming from this priority. And so I think it's important for us to prioritize positioning ourselves in healthy environments for us, for who we are, that celebrates us, that understands that our what makes us different is really where our value is, and that it's not something that's negative. And so I encourage folks to avoid burnout. Make sure that you're in healthy environments that embrace yourself, that allow you to show up authentically as you. And you know at the end of the day, it's a marathon, and so there is a lot of work to do. And so it's important for us to prioritize self-care, to unplug sometimes, and definitely understand our own limitations. Miss Shannon, as you said, like you might not be the expert at everything. And so
Right.
being resourceful even in your own network, saying, hey, maybe this opportunity isn't for me, but I do know someone who would be really good at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of those things.
Right.
All those things. I also think that one of the things that I've been really looking at as well is just understanding my why, figuring out my why. Often I feel like one of the things that can stretch us too thin or overwhelm us, make us feel so worn out, is putting ourselves into every single lane, right? And overworking ourselves. And this season I've been working on what is my why and how is that why most effective, and in what lane is it most effective, and understanding that it's this whole movement, what's on the surface and the undercurrents that are still moving, that they all lead towards the same result, right? And
Right.
we're all fighting for justice, but it's powerful to know yourself and to figure out, and that's a privileged thing to say too. I definitely acknowledge that as well, that it's not like, okay, I'm going to sit down and journal and find out who I am and why I'm put on this earth and the purpose for everything I'm doing. But I definitely think that it plays a huge role in the way that you exert your energy and the way you're being fed back, because truthfully, there are things that do energize us more than other things. And when you're in a place where you're swimming with the stream, right, as opposed to swimming, right, like you can't hire me to be a track athlete, and then and that's the way, like these athletes are out here doing amazing work, but that's going to burn me out. I'm not built for that. But I know that where I am really, what I am driven about and what I do love, I can focus and figure out my why with that space, and really cultivate my vocation and my work, and pour myself into that, and know I'll be fed. So.
Well, time has absolutely flown. I could continue talking to you. I do want to honor a few of the comments and some questions that were in the chat. So I do want to say thank you to our friend who also does so much work with us at the Twin Cities Film Fest, Mr. Lee Henry Jordan, who sums up a lot of what we said about picking your battles and trying to make sure that you do reserve that space for yourself. And thank you to everyone else who gave some questions. We did get this next question, which we are not going to be able to get to this evening because it really has so much that's in it. Is, what is it going to take to achieve racial equity in Minnesota? Thank you for that. The fact that you're even asking means that we are on the path, but we cannot cover, we can't solve that in the amount of time we have on this panel. But I do think the fact that you are asking that question, Paula, is a step in the right direction, that there are people that are working towards that see that there are still things that we can work on here. We can work on it together. That is of immense value. So hopefully you continue to ask those questions of other people in your circle so that we can find resources and commonalities and work towards things. So again, thank you to all of our panelists. I want to go around the three of you and give all of our people that are viewing and anyone who watches us in the replay to make sure that they give us they can find you on your social media, or how best to stay in contact with you and support what you do. So we'll start. I'm sorry, that was too broad. Why don't I start with Georgia?
Well, first of all, thank you for making space for us to do that. The best way to follow me, you can connect with me on my website, georgiafort.com. The links to all my social media is there. The best way to support my work, you can watch it, share it. And if you feel so inclined to become a monthly supporter, being an independent journalist is a difficult avenue in terms of making money. So always having support in that capacity is helpful.
Deborah?
Yeah, I can go next. So I'm currently building out my websites and my branding at the moment, but you can follow me on my Instagram, and soon, near the middle of this year, I'll launch the rest of my resources, which is just my first name, last name, Deborah Honore, DeborahHonore. See if you can catch all the letters, but yeah.
Perfect. And Jonathan?
Yes, Hallie Q. Brown Community Center. You can find us at www.hallieqbrown.org. It's HALLIE. Make sure you put that I before the E. And the links to our social media is there, but it's essentially Hallie Q Brown CTR on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. It is just Hallie Q.
And we will be able to, after we are done with this conversation, all of the comments and everything will exist out on our YouTube and our Facebook page. So we'll be able to go back and we can address any of those additional comments as panelists as well. So don't worry, we'll follow up with as many of you as possible. We always appreciate you supporting the Twin Cities Film Fest as well. You go to our website, twincitiesfilmfest.org. We encourage you to become a member. If you're not, you will have opportunities to support other great films and documentaries like Black Boys that we had this evening. And you also will get all the information on the other streaming events that we have coming up. Like we do have another wonderful one that's going to be coming up in March as well. So we encourage you again to go to twincitiesfilmfest.org. So Jonathan, Georgia, Deborah, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your evening with us. I hope that we get to have you back again. There's so much more that we could cover, but thank you very much for being part of this panel tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And thanks to everybody for watching. We will see you again very soon at the Twin Cities Film Fest.